Capital Offense. How Washington's wise men turned America's future over to Wall Street. Michael Hirsch. Prologue. The hippopotamus under the rug. It was the last thing Bob Rubin needed that day, at that moment in history. It was April 21, 1998. Rubin, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, was in the middle of a financial crisis that was toppling one nation economy after another. So it really was not convenient to have this humorless, difficult woman, Brexley born, marching into his magnificent Greek revival palace next to the White House, his Treasury Department, to lecture him about the dangers of derivatives. Born, that busybody from a minor regulatory agency. Born, with her pixie bangs and droning personality. Her ridiculous brown legal folder, from which she neatly extracted her talking points, and her litigator's demeanor. Born was most definitely not a member of the club. She had no sense of the smooth collegiality that characterized the top policymakers of the Clinton administration. So, what if she was running a nominally independent agency? She had no sense of place, no respect for who they were. And it wasn't just the Clintonites. Over at the Federal Reserve a few blocks away, where Rubin's pal Alan Greenspan reigned, a man who for 10 years had surgically thwarted every effort at regulation, staffers privately thought of Born as a litward wacko, recalled a former Fed official. Born was chairwoman of the little-known Commodity Futures Trading Commission, an outlier agency that didn't even have its own federal building. It rented space in the commercial district of downtown Washington. Once Born had been on the short list for Attorney General, but Bill Clinton had gone with Janet Reno for reasons Born never found out. This was her consolation prize. Still, she took her job very seriously. In recent years, she had grown increasingly alarmed by the ungoverned global trade in derivatives. Derivatives were market contracts that bet on the upward or downward movement of some underlying asset that they derived their value from, like interest rates or mortgages. Using derivatives, global companies could protect their overseas profits from market gyrations, and investors from all over the world could place bets on some country's currency, or get a piece of an entire state's mortgage payment stream. The geniuses on Wall Street were always finding new ways to repackage assets and sell them to new customers, and derivatives were the means. But Born, surveying the landscape she was now supposed to monitor for illegal or unethical behavior, began to get worried by the sheer size of the marketing derivatives that were sold over the counter, or off any exchange and out of public sight. It amounted to multiple trillions of dollars in unmonitored trading, all happening completely without the knowledge of governments. It was, in some senses, the most laissez-faire market in the world. And for the last year it had been giving Brexley Born sleepless nights. Rubin and Greenspan, however, were not terribly worried about this at the moment. And that is what counted. By this time, in the late 1990s, Rubin and Greenspan were the lions of Washington. They were an odd but endearing pair, the rumpled, or merry-eyed Fed chief and the slight, crisply bare-browed Treasury Secretary. Many in the Washington establishment thought of them as the most effective Fed Treasury team in the history of the nation, and there weren't many on Wall Street who would disagree. One man had begun his career as an A-rank libertarian, Greenspan, the other as a liberal Democrat with deep compassion for the inner cities, Rubin. Yet it was in keeping with the times that they forged the closest consensus between the Fed and Treasury, and a Republican and a Democrat, that anyone could remember. Each man canceled out any doubts people might have about the other. If Rubin and Greenspan agreed on it, it must be right. Rubin was a natural. He fit the temper of the times perfectly. There was never any learning curve with Rubin. To his admirers he had seemed to step into the role of Treasury Secretary with the effortless grace of a Fred Astaire on the dance floor, or a Ted Williams in the batter's box. Treasury is the second oldest cabinet post, after State, but at this time it had become in many ways the most prestigious. Rubin's private office elevator took him right down to the east wing of the White House. He and the president were never close, but Bill Clinton, as savvy a judge of political power as anyone could remember in Washington, trusted him implicitly, loved his dogged preparedness and passion for teamwork, and knew enough to keep Rubin out there as the public face of his pride and joy, the U.S. economy. Clinton also understood he had to keep Greenspan happy with a commitment to fiscal responsibility. Greenspan was then seen as the oracle of the age, the maestro of the 1990s boom. With each passing year at the Fed, Greenspan's runic pronouncements were weighted upon more eagerly by the market. He was a living icon. Even the fatness of his briefcase became a market indicator on CNBC. If it looked well stepped on his way into the office, that supposedly meant he was preparing an argument that rates must go up. In truth, Greenspan later wrote, all it meant was that he'd packed his lunch that day. Bexley Bourne, on the other hand, was just a lawyer, a Washington lawyer. Worse, she was a woman, and to some of those involved it also played a part in what was to happen. There is no culture more macho than Wall Street's, which is why its heaviest hitters are called, or were, once upon a time, big swing dicks, and why a vast demi-monde of massage parlors and escort services honeycombs mid to lower Manhattan. Greenspan and Rubin were, above all that, of course. They were soft-spoken gentlemen, with unimpeachable reputations. They had long since outgrown the grappling ethos of the street. Still, even though they had both worked in the nation's capital for years, both remained fundamentally men of Wall Street. Wall Street was their spawning ground. Wall Street had given them their fortunes and their worldviews. It had shaped them. It grounded them. Both Rubin and Greenspan were passionate about the key lesson they had learned from the street and brought to Washington. Finance must be allowed to flow, markets to operate unencumbered, and regulation kept at bay. Finance was the engine of innovation, America's greatest strength. Rubin and Greenspan may have lorded over economic policy making in Washington, but Wall Street, the bond and currency markets mainly, ruled Washington. Each day, the market signals emanating from the street, reinforced by its army of lobbyists, transmitted to Rubin and Greenspan the basic operating instructions for the U.S. economy. There wasn't a need for many instructions. The economy was for the most part booming on its own momentum. Sure, there were crises of capitalism. They were in the middle of one right now, the Asian contagion, a broad collapse of currencies in the tighter economies of East Asia. All the more reason why there was little time for Bexley Bourne. But even now, Greenspan, Rubin, and the latter's brilliant deputy, Larry Summers, were managing to smooth things out, giving heavy-handed advice to those wayward countries on why their currencies were crashing. Summers was in many ways the most cerebral of the three, a living repository of economic wisdom. He was the son of two economists and the nephew of two more, both Nobel Prize winners. He thought that if the East Asians would just do this, or that, behave more responsibly by opening up their financial sectors more, they might get their act together. Together the three of them were called the Committee to Save the World. Time magazine had lavished that title on them, with Rubin generously insisting that Summers be part of the cover story. And while all three had, blushingly, declined the encomium at the time, each man later hung a framed copy of the cover image on his office wall. America's economy was the beau ideal of the globe, and they were running it. We are currently enjoying the strongest U.S. economic performance in a generation, Summers had declared the year before, in a triumphal speech at the G7 summit in Denver. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union gone from the scene. Its former satellites and republics were now humble disciples of the Western way. The American way. The magic of the marketplace, as Ronald Reagan had called it in 1986, had performed miracles. The collapse of the Soviet Union had been only the beginning. It soon became clear that there was no competitor even on the horizon. Japan, which only a few years before had been seen as the up-and-coming superpower, fell into deep recession as its bubble economy collapsed. Post-Soviet Russia imploded into an economy smaller than Portugal's. The Europeans grew self-absorbed, even more self-absorbed than Americans, over their historic but still troubled experiment in combining national sovereignty with monetary union. China lumbered forward, a nation in transition, but it remained a developing country with its future as a putative superpower well ahead of it. No one was paying much attention to the Arab world, which mainly served as the gas station to the globe. The United States, meanwhile, was enjoying the most capital spending in 3 decades, the lowest unemployment in a quarter century, and so little inflation that Greenspan seemed close to hitting the central banker's sweet spot. Inflationary fears were no longer a significant factor in business decisions. America's techno-business titans, from Microsoft's Bill Gates to General Electric's Jack Welch, oversaw global empires. Wall Street, together with its Anglo-Saxon twin, the City of London, directed most of the world's increasingly privatized capital flows, diverting, in the process, a nice chunk of other nations' savings to help feed Americans' insatiable spending habits. America's economic performance, Summers said in his speech, gave us a new authority on the world stage and an opportunity to shape a world of our making. There was also a sense among the Americans that, despite the occasional financial crisis, the advanced economies had more or less tamed capitalism, introduced a new level of stability into the system. Volatility was down, risk was understood better than ever before and more diffuse. Some economists had even begun to suggest that if Americans hadn't defeated the business cycle, they'd at least gotten it under control. Sure, the Asians had their issues, just as the Latin Americans had. But they would get there eventually. As the advanced economies became more service and information-oriented, the International Monetary Fund didn't even call them industrialized anymore. They grew less vulnerable to the supply shocks, inventory overload and overcapacity that triggered recessions past. Markets were becoming complete, in the jargon of economists, and American-style financial innovation was leading the way. Information is becoming cheaper and cheaper, Robert de Clemente, chief U.S. economist at Salomon Brothers, told me back then. That's another way of saying that markets are becoming less and less imperfect. Bexley Bourne had always looked at all this triumphalism, especially Wall Street's, from afar. She had never really succumbed to the free market religion. She just wasn't part of that world. If Reuben Greenspan and Summers were shaped by the markets and driven by them, Bourne saw the markets as an animal force, necessary to our way of life, but something to be contained by law and regulation. A.W. Estate Coast wasp, what Anglo-Saxon Protestant, from a good family, she had a gentle laid-back manner that disguised, at least until you disagreed with her, a steely mind and an even hearter will. She graduated high school at age 16 and went to Stanford, where she was an English major and was considering medicine as a career until her mother, who remembered how argumentative she'd been as a child and how ferocious her sense of justice was, urged her to go to law school. She was the daughter of civil servants. Her father had been head of San Francisco's public welfare department, and the first thing she did out of Stanford Law School was to cross the country to clerk for a Washington, D.C. judge. She never left, fascinated by the public policy challenges in a capital city full of wonks and intellectuals, where everyone was just like me. As a result, Bourne came at the problem of derivatives from an entirely different direction. A different culture. She was lovely as a young woman, which may explain some of the sexism. A photo of her as president of the Stanford Law Review shows an attractive, slim Bourne seated amid her male subordinates, gazing confidently at the camera. Her father had wanted a boy and liked the name Brooks, so Bexley she became, and she grew up used to shoving our way into a man's world with a boy-girl name. Attending Stanford Law in the early to mid-60s, she'd been stunned when at the beginning of her first year, one of the men in her class angrily told her she was doing a terrible thing because she had taken the place of some man who now couldn't get a draft deferment. Bourne's classmate said the anonymous male would probably have to go to Vietnam and he might get killed. That was difficult to deal with, she recalled 45 years later, still shaken by the memory. She graduated at the top of her class, which normally would have all but guaranteed a U.S. Supreme Court clerkship, but Justice Potter Stewart politely let it be known that he wasn't ready for a female clerk, so she had to settle for the Court of Appeals. Afterward, she'd gone to work for Arnold & Porter in D.C. because it had the only female partner in town. Arnold & Porter was one of the great old white shoe firms, as Washingtonian as, say, Goldman Sachs, or Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers, were Wall Street. Arnold & Porter was a New Deal creation founded by Thurman Arnold, FDR's trust buster, and by Al Fortas, a former Assistant Attorney General and Undersecretary of the Interior. Fortas would later go on to become a Supreme Court Justice. After he was forced to resign in scandal, Arnold & Porter refused his request to come back. It was one of those monster firms that provided the corporate world with leverage in the world of patents, antitrust, and regulation, but it also had a proud reputation in public service, representing some of Joe McCarthy's victims in the early 1950s. At Arnold & Porter, Bourne had watched the futures markets grow up from the 1970s, and her practice was built around mediating between regulators and players in commodities. Because of her clients, she knew how corporate players behaved. In the 1980s, Bourne represented a large Swiss bank after the Hunt brothers attempted to corner the silver market by investing heavily in futures contracts while they were acquiring millions of ounces of silver. A case of clear-cut manipulation, which was illegal. She watched on the front lines, knee-deep in the legal morass, as the commodities markets went from unglamorous trades like coffee and sugar to more difficult-to-understand products, such as energy and financial derivatives. Bourne was a good litigator, making partner by 1974, and her reputation quietly grew in D.C. legal circles. Eventually, she came to be head of Arnold & Porter's derivatives practice. She was also heavily involved in women's rights issues by now, meeting Hillary Rodham Clinton in the mid-1980s when Hillary chaired a committee on women in the profession at the American Bar Association. By the time Bill Clinton came into office in January 1993, Bourne had developed a national reputation as a brilliant corporate lawyer and activist. She became chairwoman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in 1996, and by the time the derivatives market was growing huge. But Bourne began to get worried very quickly. She was especially concerned by what her predecessors, Wendy Graham and Mary Shapiro, were bequeathing to her. Graham, the wife of Texas Senator Phil Graham, and a conservative Republican economist, had first cracked the door to unregulated derivatives trading in 1993, when, just as she was about to leave the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, she issued two new rules sought by the industry. The effect of the two Graham rules was to allow, for the first time, the trading of over-the-counter derivatives without any oversight. And Graham did one more thing before she left. She exempted Enron from regulation in some trading of energy derivatives. Then she joined Enron's board. Bourne was especially worried about the scandals that began to crop up with greater frequency, like the first humid wisps of wind before a storm. 2 years before Bourne became chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Bankers Trust had nearly blown up two of its biggest clients, Procter & Gamble and Gibson Greeting Cards, by selling them complex derivatives products and, the evidence showed, falsely valuing them. Procter & Gamble later acknowledged it didn't understand what it was buying at all. There was the Sumitomo copper scam, when the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Enforcement Division found that the firm's chief trader, Yasuo Hamanaka, had been using over-the-counter derivatives contracts and copper to disguise loans, primarily from JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, which were being used to finance enormous speculation. Hamanaka lost $2.6 billion in unauthorized trades, the largest derivatives loss up to that time. As Bourne saw it, that made it clear that over-the-counter derivatives were beginning to play a role in manipulative activities, and also they could be used to disguise transactions on books of copper, to appear to be different in purpose from what they were. It was very close to what was later revealed to have happened at Enron. For just about everyone in official Washington, the explosion of derivatives looked like a sophisticated new dimension to global finance, one that bore out yet again that markets would take care of themselves by finding novel ways to spread risk around, so that everyone took a piece of it. And indeed, for many global corporations, derivatives were often useful as a conservative way to reduce risk, especially when it came to currency swaps. But down on the trading floors of Wall Street, things looked different. The key to many other successful derivatives trades was, in truth, deception. Back then, in the mid-1990s, derivatives traders were already putting together deals that were precursors to the subprime mortgage-backed securities that would explode in our faces a decade later. Clients on the street, many of them former physicists or other math geniuses, were always finding complex new ways to repackage assets. The schemes usually followed the same theme. The key was to take junk investments, risky but very high-yielding bonds or securities denominated in pesos or Thai baht or Malaysian ringgits, and disguise them well enough so that pension investors or insurance companies or others thought they were buying investment-grade stuff denominated in dollars. The payoff and fees for this confidence game was huge. A high-yield bond with an investment-grade rating was the Wall Street equivalent of having your cake and eating it too. It didn't really make any sense, since the only reason some bonds have high interest rates is that they're risky. If a bond gets rated at a high investment grade, say AA and above, then those who issue it, like the government, don't have to pay out too much interest. The way the investment banks got over this problem was to make the rating agencies, mainly Standard & Poor's and Moody's, part of the scheme. With the right inducements, the agencies could be persuaded to look the other way at a low-rated portion of a hybrid bond, as long as it had a dollar or two of U.S. Treasuries as part of its makeup. The new derivative bond might be based largely on high-yielding baht-denominated Thai bonds, but if U.S. Treasury yields were also thrown into the mix, then people felt better about it. The Wall Street investment banks often got the rating agencies to go along and label such a new composite derivative bond AA or AAA, the highest rating, even though a lot of the high-yielding product it was composed of was less than BBB, or junk. The banks achieved this by reminding the rating agencies subtly that they earned fees from every deal they rated. Tempted by the high yields, state, county, and local investment funds that were supposed to be playing it safe began indulging in highly risky derivatives trades undercover. The temptation of showing great returns to one's board of directors, looking like a market whiz, was just too great. And one by one, they began going up in smoke. At one point, 18 Ohio towns lost $14 million. City Colleges of Chicago lost almost its entire investment portfolio, $96 million. In 1995, the Wisconsin Investment Board abruptly announced a $95 million loss, $60 million of which was linked to investments in the Mexican peso. These state and local funds had no business investing their citizens' money in high-risk currency trades. In fact, most were banned by law from indulging in such speculation. but somehow they felt they could do it if they were packaged as derivatives. Some of these scandals were so astonishing in scope and criminality that they should have raised at least a few warning flags in Washington. Orange County, California, under its treasurer, Robert Citron, a college dropout who consulted psychics and astrologers about interest rates, had lost $1 billion and filed for bankruptcy in 1994. Again, it was a case of a Wall Street firm, Merrill Lynch, knowingly selling Citron investments that were so complex he simply could not comprehend them. But no one did anything. Bourne was worried that there were no controls on leverage, and there was also no control on speculation, the way there was on a regulated exchange. On exchanges, the authorities could place limits on speculative positions, and use other tools to talk down or moderate speculative trading. As the speculative collapses continued, there were no rules in place to stop them. There was no requirement, as on exchanges, for marking to market, or paying margin on a daily or intraday basis. So Bourne began to ask the obvious. What did they really know about this growing market? They had some ideas about how big it was, and who the major dealers were, but they didn't know how much speculation or fraud or manipulation was out there. They didn't know the extent of the private trading that was occurring out of sight. They didn't know how much leverage, or borrowed money applied to trades, there was. Or whether the dealers were doing appropriate due diligence to find out whether their counterparties, those they did derivatives deals with, were who they said they were. I realized how very little we knew and how there were these little tips of the iceberg, the mini disasters that were happening, she said. She hadn't had any particular epiphany. It was a cumulative realization that the Commission had retained authority over what had become a $27 trillion market, but it wasn't doing nearly enough oversight. Bourne also realized, to her distress, that the market had moved way beyond the exemptions that the Commission had granted. The new exemption was supposed to be limited to customized products traded between large commercial firms. The industry promptly began ignoring the rule and trading the customized derivatives instruments on the open market. Firms would get into deals where, if the original counterparty in a swaps trade no longer liked the terms, it would sell it, or novate it, away to another buyer, but without telling any regulatory authority. And because all this trading began occurring under the ever-broadening exemption, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission was left without any tools to see how the market was working, whether fraud or manipulation was occurring. For Bourne, there was a question of credibility too. You don't want to have laws on the books that markets and traders were routinely flouting, as they now clearly were. But the power shift in Washington was astonishing. Bourne first got some idea of what she was up against, the new religious belief in markets that underpinned the men in power around her, shortly after being appointed Commodity Futures Trading Commission chairwoman. Greenspan had invited her to lunch in his private dining room at the Federal, just to feel her out. She described her legal concerns. "Well, Brexley, I guess you and I will never agree about fraud," Greenspan told her. "What is there not to agree on?" Bourne replied, "Well, you probably will always believe there should be laws against fraud, and I don't think there is any need for it." Bourne literally couldn't believe her ears. But Greenspan, a decade before rampant fraud became the hallmark of the subprime mortgage bubble, was laying out his creed. The markets would take care of all, they would root out the fraud. Greenspan had written an article in Ayn Rand's newsletter back in 1963, dismissing as a collectivist myth the idea that businessmen, left to their own devices, would attempt to sell unsafe food and drugs, fraudulent securities, and shoddy buildings. On the contrary, he declared, it is in the self-interest of every businessman to have a reputation for honest dealings and a quality product. That was enough. There were other developments equally disturbing to Bourne. She was running out of time. Bills had been introduced in Congress that would have deregulated exchange trading in further significant ways. She had to do some hurry-up research when she got to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission as to what her reaction should be. And one thing that became clear was that many of the problems the futures markets had experienced were the work of large firms, the big boys at Wall Street. Bob Rubin's and Alan Greenspan's crowd. Bourne, confident of her own judgment, pushed ahead. "It seemed to me I had three options," she later recalled. "One, to ignore this, as to some extent my predecessors added. We called it the hippopotamus under the rug. Another option was to head to the other extreme, to go nuclear, asking our enforcement people to pursue, one by one, the big dealers who were violating the exemption terms. That would have meant endless and expensive litigation. The third option, which is the route she took, was to start afresh by finding out more about this totally opaque market. and assess whether there would be a better way to oversee it than a set of regulations that clearly had become totally worthless. Aware that she was trying to stem what seemed an unstoppable tide, Bourne and her staff work up the mildest sort of proposal in March, what in Washington bureaucracies is called a concept release. It was a 33-page proposal suggesting that U.S. authorities begin exploring how to regulate the vast global marketing derivatives. "We had no preconceived notions about how this should be done," said her deputy, Michael Greenberger. Then they sent the draft around to all the agencies. That's when Brexley Bourne really began to understand the nature of the forces arrayed against her. The first sign came in March. She was in her office when the phone rang. At the other end was Summers, a former Massachusetts Institute of Technology wunderkind known for his cutting arrogance. Though as Deputy Treasury Secretary he had no seniority over Bourne, an independent agency chief, Summers proceeded to dress her down, loudly. Greenberger walked in as the call was ending. She was ashen, he recalled. She said, "That was Larry Summers." He was shouting at me. Summers, channeling the views of Wall Street's finest, had been alarmed that even a hint of regulation would send all the derivatives trading overseas, costing America business. It was the unspoken assumption in those years that what was good for Wall Street was good for the U.S. economy, and vice versa. Summers told Bourne that he had a bunch of trade association reps in his office saying that it was doing enormous damage to their business for her to ask these questions, and he wanted to let her know she should just stop doing it. Bourne said, "I was astonished a position would be taken that you shouldn't even ask questions about a market that was many, many trillions of dollars in notional value, and that none of us knew anything about." A few weeks later, it all came to a climax in Rubin's ornate meeting room on the second floor of Treasury, where museum-like displays of old currency are kept. The April 21st meeting of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, which comprised Rubin, Greenspan, Bourne, and Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Arthur Levitt, was supposed to be routine. That morning, Bourne had gotten a call from John Jerry Hawke, then Undersecretary of Treasury for Domestic Finance. Hawke was no great ally. Later on, as controller of the currency, he would also lead the fight against state efforts to regulate banks. But he was also an Arnold and Porter alumnus and a friend. He knew and respected Bourne, and he was also starting to get a little worried about how wildly leveraged banks were getting. He thought he should warn Bourne that she was going to run into a wall with Rubin. And so, with some trepidation, her talking points ready, she went into the meeting. With her was her deputy, Greenberger, and her general counsel, Dan Waldman, also an Arnold and Porter graduates. It didn't take long. As soon as the meeting began, Rubin attacked the concept release. Being Rubin, he did it in a subtle way, calling Bourne strident about the position she was taking. Rubin insisted that Bourne could not go forward with the proposal. He also said the Commodity Futures Trading Commission had no jurisdiction whatsoever over the over-the-counter swaps or options, though of course the Commission had initially granted all those exemptions from its own rules. Rubin didn't bother to explain why, but he was channeling the same fears on Wall Street that Summers had conveyed in his phone call. Just by virtue of putting out a concept release, Bourne could upset the markets. Rubin was afraid she might be signaling to market players that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission had jurisdiction over derivatives bets. Giving the Commodity Futures Trading Commission jurisdiction, in turn, would, Rubin thought, lead everyone to assume these contracts were futures. Since futures were required, by law, to be traded on exchanges, all over-the-counter derivatives bets could be thrown into a legal limbo. Traders on the losing side might decide they didn't want to pay off. Trillions of dollars were at stake. It was, in truth, a silly overreaction. Bourne, who was stunned, spoke up. First of all, she said, she'd never heard or seen a legal analysis that suggested the Commodity Futures Trading Commission did not have jurisdiction over at least a very significant part of this market. Rubin responded that, well, we have the legal analysis that demonstrates you have no jurisdiction. Bourne said that it wasn't the view of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission lawyers. They assured her she did have jurisdiction. Rubin replied, yes, but those are government lawyers. I think you should be talking to private lawyers, like bank lawyers. Greenberger, sitting behind Bourne, jerked forward in his seat. It was unbelievable. Bourne had been president of the Stanford Law Review. Greenberger had been editor-in-chief of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review. Waldman had gone to another Ivy League law school, Columbia. They had all clerked for circuit court judges. They had all been in private practice in big firms until a year or two earlier. And here was Rubin telling them they weren't good enough. The Treasury Secretary then asked for Bourne's assurance that she would talk to his general counsel at night before issuing the concept release. She agreed. Rubin no doubt thought that was that. He'd ended many other meetings in just this way, simply by expressing his opinion. But Bourne wasn't done. She spoke up again. "Well, we would be very interested in seeing your legal analyses," she said. To Rubin's aides, it was nearly an act of lèse-majesté. "She came at Bob and Alan like a litigator," said one Rubin loyalist, still appalled by the spectacle 10 years later. It was as if she was suing them. Another Clinton official who was there said, "Everybody just kind of exploded at her." But he wasn't sympathetic. There was so much going on then. Then someone comes up and says, "Here's a non-problem, why don't we throw everything at it?" Rubin would later argue, in his defense, that it wasn't just what he saw as a power grab by Bourne, one that would throw trillions of dollars of contracts into dispute. He also said the industry never would have stood for Bourne's idea of regulation, and he didn't have the political power to contain derivatives trading. But it was hard to believe. Rubin, along with Greenspan, was then at the height of his power and prestige in both Washington and New York. He could have had his way. Oh, Rubin knew enough to be concerned about the uncontrolled marketing derivatives. He was also a lawyer, he'd gone to Yale, but the law for Rubin was almost an afterthought. He'd always felt the lure of the markets, gravitated back to the street. Rubin was cautious enough. He never entirely trusted models the way the most gullible Wall Street traders did. Probabilistic decision-making was his creed. You're never quite sure of anything. He fit perfectly with the Goldman culture. Take risks, but hedge, and carefully monitor your positions. But his bets usually paid off, no matter how speculative. Rubin had such fine antennae for market sentiment that he knew when things were overheated, when risk was being undervalued. It was his even-handedness that people remembered. Above all, Rubin was mainly a man of capital, and capital had always done right by Bob Rubin. As Barney Frank, the brilliantly acerbic chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, later summed up the Clinton administration's view to me, the way to a good life was to leave capital alone. Do not tax it, do not regulate it. If you do that, it will take care of you. This became known as the Washington Consensus, a set of reform policies that Rubin and company simplified into a three-pronged formula: rapid liberalization of markets, privatization, and a demand for fiscal austerity from governments. So by the time Brexley Bourne was arriving at her conclusion that something had to be done about derivatives, Rubin had long since unconsciously adopted the view that whatever permits more capital to flow is good, and whatever stops it is bad. The flow itself was an organic, beautiful thing, a beneficent thing. And while everyone must share a little blame, the main thing that makes capital stop flowing is a government that makes wrong choices. Like Mexico during the peso crisis. Or the Asian countries, which had tried to get away with easy prosperity on big deficits and currencies casually linked to the dollar. Now here was someone who wanted to throw a net over this beautiful creature, the capital markets. Rubin was no ideologue like his good friend Allen. But Bourne's proposal, something that might send a chilling message to the markets, was the last thing Rubin needed right now. In the months leading up to the concept release, Rubin had been dealing with a global crisis unlike any the world had seen for quite a while. He had handled that masterfully too. But the Asian contagion was still going on, and he hadn't had much time to reflect on what really caused it. Neither Rubin nor anyone else paid much attention to the fact that the Asian crisis was an early warning sign about the dangers of derivatives, and about the finance-dominated world they had created. Many Western banks had engaged in over-the-counter derivatives trading. Asian banks, like Mexican banks before them, had been making leveraged bets on their own markets and currencies using swaps, options, forwards, and other derivatives. One Korean investment firm, SK Securities Company, had bet with JP Morgan that the Thai baht would rise relative to the Japanese yen. When the baht collapsed, SK abruptly owed JP Morgan about $350 million and couldn't pay it. There were a lot of deals like that. The suddenness and depth of the Asian crisis had much to do with these heavily leveraged derivatives trades beneath the surface. Rubin went in and got the big Wall Street banks like Morgan to roll over or extend their debt, but without asking too deeply about where all the debt had come from. He and Greenspan and Summers were trying to resolve a crisis that stemmed from the very problems Bourne was concerned about, all without realizing it. Instead, thanks to Rubin's deft intervention, providing IMF and US aid to national treasuries, convening global conference calls, the crisis ultimately passed. And Rubin's reputation was further enhanced. People saw his profound understanding of international markets as a direct extension of his prowess at Goldman Sachs, where he made millions in risk arbitrage. So Reuben could get tough on the street, but it was always going to be a kind of tough love. And when the street began screaming about Brexley Bourne, Reuben's response was unsurprising. He would side with the street. And he would tell Bourne where to get off. The meeting at Treasury went on for about an hour and a half. Finally, toward the end, the Yoda of the group, Alan Greenspan, spoke up. He also told Bourne that just asking these questions would drive the business offshore. It was the same line that Summers had given her a couple of weeks before. Bourne responded that she wasn't aware of that, and it seemed to her that asking questions about the market would not have that impact. In fact, a later study showed that there was no loss of volume during that period. But that was that. It was over, and they all got up and went back to their agencies. As far as Reuben and Greenspan were concerned, they had killed her plan. Bourne walked out pale-faced. It was so shocking and vehement a rebuff, particularly coming from the genteel Reuben, that Sally Catson, who was a deputy of the Office of Management and Budget at the time and dealing with her own terrifying case of breast cancer, she was noticeably gone at the meeting, called up Bourne afterward to sympathize. Catson, who admired Reuben deeply, was also stunned by his manner, and what seemed to her to be a certain amount of sexism. Shortly after the meeting, Greenspan, Reuben, and Levitt, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, issued a joint statement highlighting their great concerns about the Commodity Futures Trading Commission proposal. Summers declared that it was casting a shadow of regulatory uncertainty over an otherwise thriving market. But they had all misjudged Brexley Bourne. Toughened by a career confronting high-handed men, she only dug in harder when people tried to bully her. She had her general counsel, Dan Waldman, call at night up to ask for a copy of the legal analysis Reuben had mentioned, the one that barred the Commodity Futures Trading Commission from jurisdiction. Knight didn't call back right away. "They can't pull this on us," Bourne told Greenberger. "They can't just not talk to us." The two sides went back and forth for a month, but it turned out there was no written legal analysis. Fed up, Bourne decided to publish the release and send it around seriatim, Washington jargon for getting sign-offs from independent agencies without holding a meeting. Bourne tried to stress to those who would listen that the concept release didn't make an overt play for control. Bourne, said Greenberger, was completely flexible about turf. "If they want the Securities and Exchange Commission to do this, we'll give it to the Securities and Exchange Commission," she said, Greenberger recalled. It didn't matter. The powers that be were set against her. And Reuben was so infuriated by her decision to send out the release that he never spoke to her again. So Brexley Bourne's proposal suffered the sentence of slow death that Washington's power elites mete out to undesirable ideas. They are simply ignored by the bureaucracy and shelved by Congress. She never heard back from any of the agencies about the concept release. But not before Reuben's Treasury made sure of it. According to Bourne, a White House aide was detailed to call one of her commissioners, John Tull, and express the administration's displeasure with the concept release. It was a seeming breach of ethics, interference with an independent agency. Bourne immediately complained to White House counsel Charles Rife, who later dressed the aide down and indicated that Treasury had initiated the contact. But nothing, of course, happened to Reuben, who later said he couldn't recall doing anything of the sort. For Bourne, the humiliations continued. On the day when her daughter was to go in for knee surgery at Georgetown, she was summoned abruptly by staffers for Jim Leach, the chair of the House Banking Committee, and the chair of the Agriculture Committee to appear on the Hill. At the moment they called, she was at the hospital and her daughter was about to enter the operating room. Her legislative liaison explained this to Leach and Company, but the word came back, "You need to get here anyway." So Bourne called her husband, who was a partner at her firm, and told him he'd better get out of his meeting and get over to Georgetown. Leach had earlier raised serious alarms himself about derivatives, calling them the new wild card in international finance, but he too was alarmed by the idea that the small and weak Commodity Futures Trading Commission was attempting to seize control of the derivatives market. Leach and the others berated her for an hour over the concept release. Bourne sat there and numbly, once again, tried to explain about the dangers of a vast market that none of them had any information about. Other hearings were held and the pile-on continued. At least 10 trade organizations, including the Futures Industry Association, were called on to berate Brexley Bourne. The message was always the same: no need for oversight. They were big boys. Their members were large institutional entities capable of taking care of themselves. even as she was being slowly squashed in the vice between Treasury and the Fed. To little notice, the derivatives scourge continued outside the Beltway. In the fall of the year 1998, as the Asian crisis was abating, long-term capital management collapsed under the weight of trillions of dollars in derivatives bets, and the Fed and Treasury had to bully New York bankers into liquidating its positions. This was exactly what Bourne had been waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat about. Not just the size of the thing, and the near meltdown in markets, but the fact that it came out of nowhere. No one even knew it was happening until John Merriweather of Long-Term Capital Management called up the Fed and told them. In September, Rubin declared that the world is experiencing its worst crisis in half a century. Even then Rubin refused to take Bourne's phone calls, said Greenberger. Greenberger called Gary Gensler, then Rubin's deputy, and pleaded with him to get Rubin to respond. Nothing happened. At that point Jim Leach, at least, began to see the light. He called a hearing on long-term capital management and opened it by remarking, "Well, I have to say, Ms. Bourne, you've been vindicated in your concerns." Bourne sought to seize the moment. In her testimony she compared the dangers of the over-the-counter derivatives market to the unlimited borrowing on securities that contributed to the Great Depression. It was dramatic, but it wasn't enough. The momentum against Bourne was too great, the opposition of Rubin's Treasury and Greenspan's Fed too entrenched. Bourne later said she blamed Rubin more than Greenspan. Because he knew better that markets were imperfect, yet he had not the vision nor the courage to act. It was Rubin who had inspired his adoring underlings to compile 10 principles, which they later presented to him in a frame they called the Rubin Doctrine of International Finance, the first of which was, "The only certainty in life is that nothing is ever certain," and the second of which was, "Markets are good, but they are not the solution to all problems." Rubin, knowing the markets, was a little queasy about derivatives, wondered if Treasury should do something about them on its own, far more than his deputy Summers, who with typical acerbity would make fun of Rubin for being a fogey who was still playing tennis with a wooden racket. A year later, in one of his last acts as Treasury Secretary, Rubin presided over a report of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets that hesitantly proposed, as a potential additional step, the direct regulation of derivatives dealers. Rubin himself would later insist that he'd always wanted leverage to be reduced to. But Rubin never did anything about these worries. The potential additional step was never taken. Ultimately Brexley Bourne was driven from office. In the fall of the year 1998, in the Conference Committee on that year's Agricultural Appropriations Bill, which settled the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's budget, a provision was mysteriously added, one that had never been discussed before or hadn't been in any of the bills before. No one knew exactly who introduced it, but the language was clear. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission could take no action in the over-the-counter derivatives market for 6 months. It just so happened that Bourne's term was up in 6 months. It had all been orchestrated to quash the concept release and ensure that Bourne no longer had any say. She was replaced by Bill Rayner, the co-founder of Greenwich Capital Markets and an old Clinton crony from Arkansas. Greenwich Capital Markets was later one of Wall Street's biggest bundlers of subprime mortgage-backed securities. In the 10 years after Bourne's proposal of the year 1998, the market in derivatives exploded from $27 trillion to one worth more than $600 trillion. By comparison, the entire U.S. economy was worth $14 trillion. Even when Enron collapsed 2 years later, in 2001, under the weight of all those energy derivatives that Wendy Graham had opened the door to, the result was similar. There were hearings. Congress passed a law, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, that improved corporate governance. But there were no changes on derivatives. In fact, the rules for derivatives trading were loosened further during the presidency of George W. Bush, a free market Republican who returned Reaganism to Washington. The amount of leverage that firms could use, the speculative bets they could make, was more than doubled. But Bourne had long since gone back to Arnold and Porter, and few people ever spoke her name again. Until several years later, when her worst fears turned out to be crushingly real. Why did Brexley Bourne fail? Certainly, sexism must have played a part. So did the culture clash between Washington and Wall Street. But the main reason Bourne failed was that she was taking on the impossible. She was trying to turn back the tide of an entire era. She was defying the zeitgeist. She was fighting an idea so powerful, so intoxicating, that 10 years later it required the worst crash since the Great Depression to tarnish it. And even then, it wouldn't quite go away. Much of this occurred to me in the fall of 2008, as I watched the financial system come apart and the greatest reputations of our time crash with it. As I listened to a living legend like Greenspan admit, shakily, that the assumptions of his career as an economist had been overturned, I felt that we were witnessing something that people don't often get to see: the end of an identifiable era, the era of free market fundamentalism. This book is about how an idea, that what's good for big finance and's good for America, came to define this era and then spiraled completely out of control. It is about the men, they were almost all men, who made this idea the driving force of our times and lost all sense of proportion about it, to the point where the very notion of regulation and oversight became a kind of heresy. Crucially, they ignored the key differences between financial and other markets, which economists had known about for hundreds of years. Financial markets were always more imperfect than markets for goods and other services, more prone to manias and panics and more susceptible to the pitfalls of imperfect information unequally shared by market players. After the Great Depression, authorities had understood that the financial markets must be more regulated than other markets, not least because they supplied the lifeblood of a capitalist economy: capital. Yet that critical distinction was lost in the whirlwind of fervor that championed free markets and market solutions, especially in the minds of overconfident U.S. policymakers, after the Cold War. Also lost was any sense of how much finance, when completely unleashed, had come to dominate the economy, rather than serve in its traditional role as a supplier of capital to the real economy of goods and services. It was another example of how the free market fervor simply overreached, with no restraints in place any longer. Through most of the high-tech era of the last part of the 20th century, the wizards of Wall Street were justifiably proud of the role they had come to play in providing venture capital to entrepreneurs. The ability of a smart person with a smart idea to turn it into a new company, a new product in the United States, was unmatched in the world. It was the heart of America's strength, and it was thanks in good part to the rollicking open markets on Wall Street. But somewhere along the line, toward the end of this era, Wall Street became the master of Main Street rather than its handmaiden. Wall Street turned ordinary guests into stock watchers worried mainly about the performance of their options, and tied corporate time horizons to the upticks and downticks of the stock market. Venture capitalism transmogrified into speculative fever. Innovative ways of financing new business ideas evolved into vastly complex derivatives deals that added little or nothing to economic growth. During the latter part of the free market era, for example, speculation in the shadowy derivatives market was permitted to drive up the costs of basic commodities, inflating the price of oil, rice, wheat, and corn despite plentiful supplies that normally would have kept prices low. A frenzy of buying and holding by Wall Street, and by its customers, funds advised to keep 10% of their investments in commodities, overwhelmed the physical supply and demand. As a result, in the 8 years leading up to the financial crisis, American consumers and businesses spent $1.5 trillion more on energy than they had to because of derivatives trading, said Peter Butel, who put out a widely read newsletter on the energy market. So dominant and all-consuming was this free market idea, and so admired were its champions, that it took special people to resist it, individuals of rare intellect, integrity, and courage. You needed a kind of immunity to it, as from a virus, while all around you were infected. Bexley Borgne was one of those unusual people. Another was Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who in some ways was the John Maynard Keynes of his era. Stiglitz had grown up in Gary, Indiana, one of the grittiest industrial cities in the United States, and from the time he was a small boy, he had begun to ask questions about why markets didn't work well. Like Keynes, who was ignored when he warned after World War I that the draconian peace imposed on Germany would lead to disaster, Stiglitz stood almost alone against the Washington Consensus lorded over by Rubin, Greenspan, and Summers. A brilliant abstract thinker, Stiglitz sought to use the free marketers' own tools against them. He developed mathematical models that proved, paradoxically, that even if you assume rational human behavior, the economic outcome would often not be rational or reach equilibrium on its own. He showed that small changes in the free marketers' assumptions led to dramatic changes in outcomes, which they could not predict. But for nearly a decade Stiglitz was mocked as an extremist rock thrower, and finally, like Bexley Borgne, he was driven from the free market paradise that Washington became. This book will be about him and others, such as Roy Barnes, a banker who became the governor of Georgia. Barnes saw, from the front end, the plague of predatory lending in a state that was driven largely by Wall Street's hunger for mortgages to slice and dice and package as securities. When he tried to halt the practice, he too was crushed by an army of lobbyists that invaded Georgia from Washington. It is a book about Frank Portnoy, a derivatives trader at Morgan Stanley, who grew sickened by the kinds of scams he was engaged in and later became a Cassandra-esque crusader for regulatory reform. And it is about men such as Benjamin Anka, the Great Depression scholar and Fed chairman who finally saw the light, just in time to stop another depression. It's not as if the people who were the champions of the free market ideal were bad men. They had their country's best interests at heart. They were, for the most part, outstanding public servants who performed as admirably as they did falteringly, mixing periods of triumph with vast errors of judgment that verge on tragedy, at least in the loss of their reputations. They did not seem to understand, until it was too late, that they were overselling an idea that modern economics had already proven to be fatally flawed, the idea that markets always self-correct, and finance was safe. Alan Greenspan, one of the chief characters of my story, was the most lionized Fed chief in history. Yet he later admitted he didn't understand the market system he had shaped and dominated for 18.5 years. Robert Rubin performed brilliantly as a crisis manager during the 1997-1998 Asian contagion, yet somehow he could not see or appreciate its deeper causes, just as he would later miss the crisis developing under his nose as a senior counselor at Citigroup in the 2000s. Rubin always had a big heart and a gentle manner. He was a liberal Democrat who, as a young trader at Goldman Sachs, used to show up at New York community meetings on the inner-city poor. Later on he opposed Bill Clinton's welfare-workfare reform, a much-criticized compromise with the GOP, as too harsh. But he could not bring himself to lay a restraining hand on his former colleagues from Wall Street. A decade after his start turn as Treasury Secretary, as the floodwaters of the subprime disaster lapped at his executive suite high atop the Citigroup building on Manhattan's East Side, Rubin mulled over with me the consequences of what he had wrought. We have a market-based financial system, and yet we have a whole bunch of institutions that are too big or too interconnected to fail, Rubin told me in puzzled tones. Yet the market-based system is the way to go. How do you reconcile all that? The fundamental theory of the market case is premised on the notion that failure or success reap their own rewards. But now that's not happening. Indeed, it remains the central pathology of our times. We have created a free market system dominated by institutions so huge and systemically important that they no longer have to play by free market rules. As this book will show, Rubin himself had been one of those who engendered this pathology, but somehow he couldn't own up to any responsibility. It must also be noted that despite all the mistakes, these architects of the global financial system helped preside over a magnificent period of growth as well as a revolution in world affairs, the end of the Cold War. One of them was Milton Friedman, the great anti-Keynesian economist who was another key figure in this story. Friedman was right about much of what he said and wrote about markets, especially during the period when we were caught up in the great Cold War fight of freedom versus socialism. But he and his acolytes were so sure of themselves that they transformed that wisdom into a false sense of scientific certainty about the functioning of financial markets. Still, after the subprime disaster, one of Friedman's acolytes at the University of Chicago, Gary Becker, pleaded, "Don't kill the goose that laid the golden eggs." According to figures calculated by Becker and his own free market acolyte at the University of Chicago, Kevin Murphy, from the year 1980 to 2007, the growth in world gross domestic product was about 140%. Even if you assumed a depression, a world economy that contracted by 10% over the 2 years after the subprime disaster, you still ended up with enormous growth. Hundreds of millions of people brought out of poverty, Becker said. So yes, markets are imperfect, but they delivered a lot. Becker had an important point about a period loosely associated with freer markets. Still, he neglected to mention that the earlier period, from the year 1945 to the year 1976, when financial markets were tightly regulated, had shown even more robust global growth. And it was growth that was far more equitable, without the vast gaps in income between poor and rich, especially the financial rich, that marked the free market era. In the latter stages of the era of free market absolutism, the question was no longer what Friedman contributed to the triumph of market capitalism. He had clearly played a formidable role. It was whether Friedman and his acolytes had taken things too far. Every revolution tends to overreach. And so did this one. Free market absolutism was not a new phenomenon, of course. Indeed, it was very similar to the laissez-faire thinking that led to the Depression and made Herbert Hoover such a disaster as president, and which FDR had to address with a Keynesian response, though he himself had little use for Keynes. The stock market crash of the year 1929 had evolved into a terrible decade-long depression in large part because the Fed and Treasury at the time had thought the markets would correct on their own, even as a third of the nation's banks were collapsing. Andrew Mellon's infamous response after the crash of the year 1929 was to allegedly declare, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers. Hoover's Treasury Secretary earned himself a permanent place in the annals of American villainy with those words. But all Mellon was doing was administering the standard laissez-faire wisdom of the time: allow the market to clear by selling. The problem was, things were probably too far gone for that to happen without a very painful depression. The Depression was the first large-scale demonstration in a modern economy of the economic wisdom that Stiglitz and others would later tease out with their mathematical models, that often, unaided by government, markets fail. It's what Bernanke had learned in his own studies, and why he revolutionized the Fed's lending practices in the space of 6 months in 2008 and early 2009, tripling its balance sheet to $2 trillion in an effort to keep Wall Street afloat. Bernanke was determined not to go down as the Fed chairman who had allowed a second-grade depression. But at the height of the market hubris, in the 1990s and 2000s, much of that wisdom had been forgotten. In its modern incarnation, the reign of free market absolutism began as the Reagan Revolution of the year 1981, which launched a deregulation movement that unmoored much of the economy from government oversight and antitrust laws, creating the wild age of finance with which we've all grown up. From barbarians at the gate to conspiracy of fools, it was a decades-long spree of buyouts and swaps and crazy new collateralized instruments no one, in the end, could understand. For nearly 25 years, the facts on the ground seemed to bear out the idea that markets may overreach and go up and down, but they are always smarter than governments. The deregulatory 1980s were a boom time. The 1990s were better. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 seemed to prove, once and for all, the unworkability of statism and so-called command economies. Free market absolutism went from being the mocked, maverick ideology, something identified in the 1960s and 1970s with Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley, to a kind of national secular religion. It seized control of the national agenda and shifted the axis of the entire economic debate sharply rightward, turning ordinary Republicans into small government zealots and liberal Democrats into Eisenhower Republicans. That's what Bill Clinton mockingly called himself. Then the phenomenon went global. Around the world, as well as in Washington and on Wall Street, free market fervor produced an infectious passion for deregulation, especially in the early 1990s. On the advice of the U.S.-dominated International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and under the tutelage of young free marketers, many newly reformed nations began dancing to the tune dictated by the victor of the Cold War. Foreign exchange controls were lifted worldwide, and in an astonishingly short period of time, a stream of private capital began circling the globe, fed by giant mutual, pension, and hedge funds and freed to roam at will, by worldwide telecommunications and computer network. Pools of globalized capital began moving from country to country, like some ectoplasmic monster, creating bubbles in one economy after another depending on which one looked the most inviting at the time. The era continued through the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton, a centrist New Democrat who resisted the call of the market gospel at first, but then succumbed, and finally right up until the final months of George Bush's 8 years, when it all flamed out, forcing the conservative president to repudiate the market philosophy more totally than anyone since FDR. And we all came to realize, or should have, that the flaws in capitalism we once blamed on other nations like Mexico or Thailand or Korea, lay at the heart of our own financial system and economic model for the world. But not everyone has understood this. Even now, and among the most worrisome laggards are Barack Obama's chief policymakers, the architects of the solution, who by no coincidence helped to author the disaster. It is a role that few of them even now can bring themselves to admit. Some of the policymakers of the 1990s and 2000s have had a reckoning with themselves and admitted error. Most others have not. As Arthur Levitt, the Securities and Exchange Commission chairman who went along with the pillorying of Brexley, born in 1998, told me 10 years later, all tragedies in life are always preceded by warnings. We had a warning. It was from Brexley born. We didn't listen. Soon afterward, having heard about such comments, Larry Summers privately remonstrated with Levitt, telling him he shouldn't concede that Bourne was right. That is the great danger going forward. Wall Street is resurrecting itself. But it is too much the same old Wall Street, with too much of the same sense of certainty and too little concern, even now, about the impact it is having on society at large. In Washington, meanwhile, most economic thinkers continue to view the recovery of the stock market as the best measure of the health of the economy. The subprime mortgage securitization scandal and the global crisis of capitalism that followed it had many proximate causes: a long period of loose credit orchestrated by the Federal Reserve, The mega expansion of the financial sector, as Kevin Phillips called it, in which capital flows dwarf trade flows. The vast power of the Wall Street and banking lobby in Washington, the extraordinary imbalance in global capital flows that rain money on Americans in the 1990s from places like East Asia and the Middle East, among other things. The explosion in derivatives trading connected up all these trends, making the ultimate failure a global one, and to raise the stakes, because all these firms were using derivatives to double and triple down on their betting. But all these things are still only symptoms. The main reason the catastrophe occurred is that the people in charge of our economy, otherwise intelligent and capable men like Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers, and later Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, permitted themselves to believe, in the face of a rising tide of contrary evidence, that markets are for the most part efficient and work well on their own. Summers, for example, after the stock market crash of 1987, had written that it was impossible to believe any longer that prices moved in rational response to fundamentals. He even advocated a tax on financial transactions. Yet Summers, one of the world's most astute economists, later abandoned these positions in favor of Greenspan's view that markets will take care of themselves. How could such a powerful intellect continue to believe and advocate this view, despite the plentiful accumulating evidence that the efficient market hypothesis did not hold up, including his own work? Mainly because the new religious attachment to free market absolutism had become a ruling principle that no single senior official in Washington dared to contradict, especially if he was politically ambitious, with a few lone exceptions like Drexley Bourne. As John Maynard Keynes wrote, it is the gradual encroachment of ideas that matters in the end far more than vested interests. It is ideas that are dangerous for good or evil. The Wall Street lobby could not have transformed Washington and the economy without the idea of free market fundamentalism behind it. This book tells the history of how this idea took hold and very nearly brought down the global economy with it, along with what remained of America's global reputation as a beacon and a model. It is also about how, unless more fundamental rethinking of capitalism occurs, this could all happen again, sooner than you think.